Well, hello and welcome to Raj Sabha TV. You're watching discussion today with me, Rajat Kane. In this episode, we'll discuss External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's address at the United Nations Security Council or the UNSC open debate 20 years after the adoption of Resolution 1373. Now, this debate focused on combating terrorism on the global front in what was India's first intervention since joining the UNSC as a temporary member on 1st of January. Jaishankar underlined that terrorism as the greatest threat to mankind and proposed an 8-point plan to ensure an effective action against the terrorism. Now, these points included summon the political will to combat terrorism. That's how he called upon all the member nations, and no double standards in the battle against terror, reforms in working of the bodies dealing with the sanctions and counter-terrorism, especially at the platform of UN, firmly discouraging exclusivist thinking that divides the world and also harms the social fabric. Now, objective listing and delisting of individuals and the entities, exposing the linkages between the terrorism and transnational organized crime, which is, of course, the parallel structure that supports terrorism across the world and combating terrorism financing and adequate funding to UN Counter-Terrorism bodies. So clearly, these were among the 8 points highlighted by Union External Affairs Minister. How important was his intervention? How important are these salient features to fight terrorism? To discuss further on this issue, we're joined with our guest, Professor Harshvi Pant. He is head of strategic studies in ORF, and we had joined with Dr. D.P. Srivastav. He is former ambassador. Well, many thanks for joining us, sir. Let me begin with you, Mr. D.P. Srivastav. Sir, looking at the geopolitical scenario at present, how important do you see, let's not say the UN External Affairs Minister's intervention, but of course, like the India's address at the UNSC debate?
If you look at the geopolitical context of South Asia, you realize that as US troops withdraw from Afghanistan, there is a threat of resurgence of violence and terrorism. This comes towards the close of the Trump presidency.
Yeah.
And before the Biden presidency has been inaugurated. It was Afghanistan which provided sanctuary to Al-Qaeda and which led to the events of 9/11. Unless we move quickly to address this problem, there could be a recurrence. But to the east of Afghanistan and is the other neighbor, which is Pakistan. And the problem actually in 9/11 and again today arises from that country, because terrorism today is not simply an act of lone warriors or lone wolf or individuals, but it is the network supported by states. And this again requires intervention of the UN Security Council. EM statement is timely, but as he pointed out, it requires political will, without which it will not be possible to put in effect the mechanisms which have already been created.
Right.
The problem of terrorism is a global problem. The world had witnessed the ISIS, which arose in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And we have seen these incidents in Europe and across the Atlantic in USA. So the international community has to come together to address this problem.
That's important opening remarks, Ambassador Srivastav, and you clearly pointed out this timely intervention statement by the External Affairs Minister. Professor Pant, let me get you in the debate. So, I mean, we will obviously dissect the important points, but let's begin with the first point. Yeah, the political will to take on the terror. Now, when the External Affairs Minister says that, is he pointing towards that there is still lack of political will at the global stage to actually take on the terror?
Yes, clearly, I think there has been this long-standing complaint from India that when it comes to terrorism, we still see this divide that sometimes some terrorists are good terrorists, some terrorists are bad terrorists, depending on your geopolitical, geostrategic interests. And the global community has not been able to come together to tackle this menace, despite all countries facing the challenge, as the ambassador was pointing out. Today, we are witnessing it in Europe, and in the context of this special session of the UNSC, I think
Right.
two things are important. One, that India was making its case, at a very early stage when India has taken on the non-permanent membership at the UNSC, and I think India was laying down the marker that these would be important considerations for India in the UNSC over the next 2 years. India would like to work on this extensively with its partners to make sure that terrorism continues to remain on global agenda with the degree of seriousness that it deserves. And secondly, I think the whole statement was harking back to 9/11, and it was the post 9/11 context that we have seen. That the UN Security Council had come together, stated, passed its resolution, but since then we have seen withering away of that sentiment, and gradually countries have become more and more inward looking. Countries have, in particular, I think he was also pointing out that those countries that support elements that prevent certain things from happening at the UNSC, like China in particular, I think the statement was directed at. So we have seen all countries, major powers, at times shirking their responsibility, and as a result, terrorism has only grown in potency, and it's only grown in the range. And that's the challenge that India, I think, was trying to highlight, and possibly will highlight over the next 2 years as it sits at the UN Security Council.
Well, that's important, Professor Pant. Now, this is certainly, we have seen this phenomenon of certain countries pointing out, as you said, the good terror, the bad terror, and that's also what was remarked by External Affairs Minister as well. Ambassador Srivastav, do you also agree that there is still a dichotomy when to say, or a lack of parity in actually denouncing terror head-on or at a unilateral scale? There is a division. Countries say, okay, fine, this possibly could be issue for you, but not for us. And taking your side doesn't quite give us any advantage. Is it so? And that's why terrorism seems to be having a long rope.
This is a long-standing problem, and it has got worse. Recently, we witnessed last year terror attacks in France, while most of the international community condemned them unreservedly. This was, killing of innocent civilians, a school teacher, a 60-year-old lady in a church. There were states which simply talked about, philosophical issues, basically to divert attention, and in fact blame the French authorities, who were actually the victims of the terror attacks. So this double standard is there. It's also reflected in the legal structure at home. The same country, and let me give you an example, Pakistan, which invokes this principle most frequently, has not only special laws to fight terrorism at home, it has established anti-terror courts. These are special courts which have, they have carved out a separate jurisdiction for them,
right,
with fast-track prosecution and change in the rules of evidence to ensure that the prosecution and conviction takes place quickly. And on the other hand, you see Pakistan dragging its feet in convicting Lakhavi, who was involved in the Mumbai terror attacks of 2008. And despite a gap of 12 years, and we only see occasional actions, and that action is taken only when there is pressure from the West. Let me give you one more example. There was, this killing of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal journalist, in 2002, January, in Karachi. And the man who was accused of murdering him has still not been convicted.
Yes, Umar
The
Sheikh.
man who gave him shelter in at his residence, who was then who was then head of the Punjab security establishment, became interior minister in Imran Khan government
Right.
till the recent reshuffle about a month and a half ago. He was interior minister of Pakistan. Now, what would you call it? This is blatant double action by a state which has sponsored terrorism not only against India but also against Afghanistan and in Iran. And it has worked out a separate legal regime to prosecute terrorists where it affects their actions affect its interests, but otherwise it looks the other way.
Exactly. So clearly, there seems to be a partisan action from certain states on terror. Another important issue, Professor Pant, let me start with you here, happens to be the funding of terror. Now here, as we say, there is already a lack of parity in taking on the terror, and also like the funding of terror happens to be still going unchecked at several levels. So, how big this menace is, Professor Pant?
Well, clearly, I think the funding issue is very, very important, and we have seen how the world has coalesced around the view that unless you tackle the sources of funding, whether it's money laundering and other mechanisms which needs to be tackled, we won't be able to manage this problem. And what we have seen for some time at least. With India's persistence, we have also seen some pressure being used through FATF, Financial Action Task Force, that has been working and trying to bring Pakistan and several other countries to account. But clearly, we also see how that can be manipulated. We also see how various, one country in particular, one major power has used its clout in Financial Action Task Force to shield Pakistan. So what I think the issue has been that while there has been this growing understanding, that unless we go to the source of money, the real roots of the problem can't be destroyed. But the operationalization of that idea has been found wanting, and we are still, and I think therefore you had External Affairs Minister also talking of greater coordination with Financial Action Task Force and greater powers to Financial Action Task Force, and I think greater accountability in the way we are looking at the functioning of certain institutions that manage and that take into and that are responding to this challenge of money laundering or anti-terror mechanisms. And I think that's a larger issue in terms of how do you make institutions work in an era where great power competition is rising, where countries are increasingly, major powers in particular, are looking once again to terrorism as something that they can use and exploit in their great power game. And I think to put the blame where it lies, and if you're talking of Pakistan today, Pakistan would have been much more marginal had it not been for the sanction or support that it gets from China. So clearly now the challenge is how do you bring on board some of these bigger countries, in particular China, to recognize the challenge. And when it comes to its own issues, it recognizes the challenge, and it is very harsh when it deals with its own internal dynamic. But when it comes to global cooperation, it looks at this issue through a very, very narrow prism. And in the process, I think a lot of the initiatives that the world has created, including Financial Action Task Force-like initiatives, they become more crippled. So I think even the fight against the resourcing, money, and other kind of support system infrastructure that is needed to build the terror machinery, we have to look at how major powers need to cooperate with each other better. But I think the optimism for that is not very high at this point in global politics.
I'll come back to you, Professor Pantan, and continue discussion on the issue of the financing of the terror. And of course, we'll take up the syndicates which is sponsoring terror. But let me go off to Ambassador Srivastava here. Sir, I mean, as Professor Pant pointed out, like intervention, or to say lack of support of China on certain important points has of course like has been a letdown of sort. So, I mean, how difficult it gets to have a country or a member nation at the UNSC which is not quite standing on the issue or not quite standing on parity on the issue of terrorism?
Well, unless if the authority to give clearance for action against terror cells or those who are providing funding is based in the Security Council, you have this problem of domination by the permanent members, and they have a veto. Now, veto itself is a function of the consensual decision making. This is something which needs to be reformed. UN in other areas works on the basis of vote. So if you take away this veto power, it will be easier to take action against terror groups. And this indeed, in Security Council does allow, procedures do allow action by vote. In other areas, that same procedure should be extended to determination of action against terror groups.
Right. Ambassador Srivastava, the External Affairs Minister, also pointed out at certain reforms within the global body, within UNSC, on certain committees which takes a call on the sanction of entities or the individuals.
As we are discussing, it's very important to reform the working of the committees dealing with terrorism and sanctions. And these reforms essentially center on the consensual procedure of decision making, which gives a veto to permanent members.
Right.
And which is what has been misused by China in shielding the Pakistani terror groups in the past. Now, like the rest of the work of the UN, which is based on voting, the same procedure can be followed here, or at least there should be a carve out that on critical issues, the decision will be taken by vote if no consensus is possible within a reasonable frame of time.
Right. Yeah, Professor Pant, just continuing on the same point where Ambassador Srivastava just ended. Now, given United Nations, given the repute of the body that was formed, or we can say in a more allegorical term, on the ashes of the end of the World War and looking towards a brighter world, you think there is a need for reforms? I know we have been debating this issue about reforms at the UNSC. We've been asking for rejuggling of the team, but I mean, what perhaps would take for the reforms to strike this body, or to say at least to have reforms at the UNSC?
Well, I think two things have happened. One, if you look at the Prime Minister's statement last year when he addressed the UN General Assembly, I think he made this point pretty powerfully that India cannot forever wait for these reforms to happen.
Right.
So if reforms are not happening, that is, that challenges the credibility of UNSC, that challenges the credibility of the UN. And Indians also look at it with a degree of skepticism, that here is an organization that was meant to tackle some of the world's most serious problems, and here terrorism is one of them. India is one of the worst affected countries from terrorism, and has been trying to make a case. Again, the Indian government has made it repeatedly that it is about humanism versus terrorism is the big battle of our times.
Yes,
so clearly, when the whole humanity is facing this crisis, for UNSC not to come to terms with the challenge is in itself pretty bewildering. And again, when you look at the foreign minister's statement, the 8-point agenda that he has laid out, I think what he has done is he has done exactly what you are asking, that he has given some markers, some pointers on
Yes.
specifics that these things can be done, even if there is no possibility of a bigger reforms in the UN Security Council. Perhaps when looking at an issue like terrorism, we can come to some sort of an agreement, whether it has to do with committees, whether it has to do with the larger political agreement, whether it has to do with the functioning of organizations like FATF and how they interact with the United Nations. I think all those things are important, because unless you have a comprehensive and a holistic approach to this problem, we are not going to move forward. And we have not moved forward, by the way. Even
Yes,
the definition of terrorism
absolutely.
still remains a problem. We have not been able to come to terms, come to define terrorism and come to have a globally acceptable definition of terrorism via the UN. So therefore, the challenge is, and I think that's what perhaps India would like to do as a non-permanent member, is to push this agenda over the next 2 years to see how far it can go. Because clearly for India, that's a national security imperative. And for global politics, that's a larger structural imperative.
Professor Pant, as we are about to go to the close of the show, just like comprehending further on your explanation of nexus between the terror financing and certain groups. Now here we have certain other syndicates who perhaps may not be in terrorism to say off in definition of terror, as you said, but could be financing terror. So how difficult or how important it gets to actually break that nexus?
Very important, because see, crime syndicates, terrorism, drug trafficking,
Yes.
the Hawala networks, all of these are interconnected in the darker side of the web, in the darker side of international politics. I mean, these are the things that we often don't talk about, but governments are aware how important this is for internal security. And now in this era of globalization, how this is all interlinked globally. So when you have globally, global syndicates which can operate from anywhere, given the technological sophistication of our times, we need to be very careful as to how we are, how we are managing this threat from within our borders. Now, governments certainly, do not have jurisdiction over what is happening in other countries' territories, and therefore you need global cooperation. And therefore, when countries like China and others take a very narrow view of this problem, they should realize that it's going to rebound on them. Something that has happened in Pakistan. This idea that Pakistan can continue to fester, can continue to make it life difficult for other countries without actually getting challenged. We know now that that is not true. Pakistan is on the brink of collapse, partly because the terror networks that it was fostering have come back to bite it. So I think the larger problem, therefore, remains that we need these, whether it's crime syndicates, whether it's drug traffickers, whether it's piracy, all of these broader issues require the kind of global cooperation that is often seen in rhetoric but not in reality, unfortunately.
Right. That's important. Just last words, Professor. I beg your pardon, Ambassador Srivastav. How important does it get to acknowledge a threat from these crime syndicate, as to we have this threat equally from the terrorism?
Crime syndicates are part of the ecosystem on which terror groups depend for their actions or support. But we do not want to go away from the main problem. The main problem is not the actions of individuals or groups. The main problem is actions of states.
Right.
And that is something which UN Security Council is uniquely equipped to address. Security Council or the UN's mandate is to deal with interstate problems. Its mandate does not involve dealing with individuals or groups. So I think we should keep this fundamental issue in mind. That is, the focus should remain on the state's responsibility to prevent terrorism. And from there, the rest of things follow.
Well, that's right. We wrap up on this note. Many thanks, Ambassador D.P. Srivastav. Many thanks, Professor Harsh V. Pant, for elucidating and, of course, comprehending further on 8 important pointers listed by Union External Affairs Minister in his address at the UNSC, and of course, like the threats posed by terror and, of course, terror syndicates. But by and large, it's the willingness, willfulness, and, of course, like commitment to end the terror that'll actually tilt the scales. Well, many thanks for watching this episode of Discussion Today. Keep watching Rajya Sabha TV for more.